This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
The young shining cuckoo is fed by its foster parents on insects and spiders. But the korimako, or bellbird, has a much more interesting diet of nectar. It's been something of a radio personality and has sung on shortwave radio to Australia and the Pacific nations for 30 years. However, the early recordings failed to reflect the versatility of the bellbird, with its wide variety of liquid notes and artistically placed clicks and bell-like sounds. It's not surprising that Maori mythology describes korimako, the bellbird, as the messenger of Tane, sent to herald the coming of the sun.
Community or chaos? We can construct and nurture community or fall into chaos. Over the next hour, Marvin Hubbard hosts conversations toward creating a fairer, more equal society.
Community or Chaos is made possible with the support of Quakers Aotearoa. You'll find them online at quaker.nz.
Good morning, friends. Today we have Karen Scott with us, who is a professor of the Faculty of Law at Canterbury University and is the editor-in-chief of Ocean Development and International Law, and gave a good talk on preserving international law at the Otago School of Politics. Probably mispronounced. Probably got the last word of that title wrong, but I think that'll do. Welcome to Community or Chaos. A bit of chaos never hurts. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Marvin. How are you?
Good. Well, Karen, what led you to get a law degree, and why did you specialize in international law and instead of corporate law? I know which one would give you the most money.
Well, that's true. One doesn't generally go into international law for the money. I think what led me to get a law degree actually was a history class in my high school or secondary school. And we had an exercise across a number of weeks where we put Richard III on trial for putting the princes in the tower back in 40, whatever it was. And I was given the task of defending Richard III. We had a mock trial. And I'm very pleased to say that I got him off. So that really kind of led to an interest in the law, which I hadn't really thought about prior to that. So I did law at A-level. Was educated in the UK. And then I ended up doing law at the University of Nottingham. In terms of international law, I've always been interested in sort of international politics, and I've always had a kind of a fascination with the marine environment and with Antarctica. I always used to ask for books for my birthday on the marine environment in Antarctica. And those are kind of areas where international law is highly relevant. So I ended up being sort of drawn to those areas. So that's really how I ended up where I am at the moment in terms of my research and teaching interests.
Well, the South, the Antarctica is very special when it comes to climate change.
It absolutely is, yes.
And you can go back a million years by just drilling into the core.
Yes, so Antarctica has given us so much information on our climate and our historical climate. So a fundamental role as well as being hugely vulnerable to climate change, yes.
What is the Anthropocene, and does it relate to international law? And how does it relate to international law?
So the Anthropocene, which is, had a lot of discussion over the last few years, is really an unofficial geological epoch. And it follows from the Holocene. And most would argue that it begins around the 1950s. And it really reflects the idea that humankind has had such an impact on our Earth systems, whether that's on climate, freshwater, saltwater, biodiversity, that the impact is really the equivalent of a geological force, to the extent that we really should rename the current era we are in. So Anthropocene is really designed to reflect sort of the geological force equivalent of humankind. The term was actually proposed by a chemist, Paul Crutzen, in 2000, and has gained, as I say, quite a significant support. Although in 2024, the International Union of Geological Sciences rejected the proposal that it should formally be established as an era, essentially us moving from the Holocene to the Anthropocene. But in a way, that doesn't really matter, because actually, unlike kind of our previous geological epochs, such as the Holocene, the Anthropocene is kind of as much a political or an ecological concept as a geological concept. As I say, intended to kind of emphasize that role of humankind in changing our Earth systems.
If you accept that title, aren't you also accepting responsibility for the environment we're in?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we should accept that responsibility. I think as humankind does need to accept the responsibility for its very significant impact on the environment. And of course, that is, one of the roles of international law. So I would certainly agree with that.
Could you talk about how serious for humanity and climate change may be? And what are the meaning of tipping points when talking about global change?
Well, I'm obviously not a scientist, but over 2,000 scientists, which have kind of come together to produce these major periodic reports. They're the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and there have been 6 major reports so far, are in agreement that climate change is hugely serious for humanity and indeed for non-human species. Obviously, our planet is warming at a more rapid rate than it has done for hundreds of thousands of years. It looks as though we're pretty much at a 1.5 degree temperature rise already above pre-industrial levels. In Christchurch, just 2 weeks ago on Saturday, it was 26 degrees at the end of June, which is quite remarkable. There are heat waves in Europe, marine heat waves, and obviously climate change will have kind of implications for water, for food, for habitation, for migration. So I certainly see climate change as being, a really enormous challenge, for humanity across the world. And I think it's kind of global reach, which is what makes it so significant. In terms of kind of tipping points, those are kind of the critical thresholds at which you get to the point where change triggers a major shift, which is arguably irreversible, where we kind of move into a new state. So scientists use the idea of kind of tipping points as to identify a threshold at which, beyond which, you can't necessarily go back. So things like melting the Greenland ice sheet, the Antarctic Western ice sheet would be a tipping point. The level of sea level rise associated with that means that you wouldn't be able to go back. Drying out the Amazon forest, melting permafrost in the Arctic, kind of the loss of all coral reefs, they could all potentially constitute tipping points.
We've been looking at this for some time. James Hansen in America, a climate scientist, was talking about this 40 years ago. Why have corporations and much of the power elite and most countries, with some exceptions, not taking climate change more seriously, judging by their actions? And does this lack of serious action to mitigate climate change have anything to do with our economic system?
Well, we could probably use quite a crude American catchphrase, it's the economy, stupid. I think it's probably all about the economy. And you're quite right. Scientists have been raising the alarm since at least the mid kind of 1980s. The first IPCC report was 1988, and the Climate Change Convention was adopted in 1992. So that's over 30 years ago. So we've essentially acknowledged, recognized, taken initial steps with respect to climate change, for well over 30 years. But obviously the action we've taken has been significantly insufficient. And I think you're absolutely right. It is essentially all about our economy, for both states and indeed large companies, changing the Western capitalist model, is really challenging. And of course, that model now is global. So those states which are not kind of democratic states also have a capitalist style economy. And of course, you have companies with hugely vested kind of interests, particularly in fossil fuels, and it's very difficult to change those. And if you go back actually to the concept of the Anthropocene, that's actually one of the issues that concept seeks to address, because one of the assumptions of sort of our era up to this point, kind of the Holocene era, is perpetual economic growth. I mean, that has really kind of characterized the development of society for many hundreds of years, this idea of perpetual economic growth. But of course, that's not sustainable in the Anthropocene, but moving away from that, conceptually really difficult.
Well, actually, I think the economy has gotten more, has actually gotten less controlled from the 70s on. Neoliberalism despises government and regulation. And for instance, we know that the Tea Party, which was led to Trumpism in America, was funded by coal and oil companies. And they also denied the first corporation, the first people outside of people like James Hansen who knew about the dangers of climate change were the oil companies. And they hid it purposely. In fact, they followed in the line of cigarette companies in denying that there was any problem.
Yeah, they absolutely did. And they were hugely influential in terms of their lobbying. They also sort of contributed to research in order to sort of make their opinions respectable. And I think the parallel with the tobacco industry is a really pertinent one. And I think you're absolutely right. There's arguably less control these days. And of course, another issue is in terms of information. And of course, a lot of the social media companies, AI, which actually means that it's much more difficult to kind of control information, control what those companies do.
It seems to me that part of the problem is that the only institutions that could probably make real changes that are strong enough for climate change are governments. If we had a strong UN, of course, that would help, but that doesn't look too helpful now. But
yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think governments do need to take the lead, because
it doesn't feel like the lobbyists have quit. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the New Zealand government and environmental lobbies, anti-environmental lobbies, to be honest, sending their suggestions for law change directly to ministers. That doesn't sound terribly positive.
No, I don't think that would be very positive at all. And I think New Zealand actually has not got a particularly, hasn't got a strong track record over the last few years on climate change. If we look at our second nationally determined contribution, which we submitted a few months ago under the Paris Agreement, its ambition is pretty weak. So we've essentially said we'll reduce greenhouse gas emissions by between 51 and 55% below 2005 levels by 2035, which is barely an increase on our first NDC. And of course, as you've alluded to, legislation is going through to essentially stop the courts from considering whether tort law can be used to address climate change. So I would say New Zealand has got quite a weak track record over the last few years in relation to climate change. It's certainly not demonstrating global leadership.
Don't we have a moral obligation to deal with climate change? And don't we also have a moral obligation to govern for the common good? And some people would argue the common good includes the world we live in.
Well, I would absolutely agree with that. And of course, future generations would be part of that common good. I would say we have a moral obligation, but actually we also have a legal obligation. We've signed up to commitments under the Climate Change Convention, But we also have obligations under international law more generally, whether that's in relation to the law of the sea or customary obligations to protect the environment. And last year, the International Court of Justice issued a really important advisory opinion where it set out in quite a bit of detail, what legal obligations states have under international law to take action to address climate change, which includes things like phasing out fossil fuels. So I would suggest it's not simply a moral obligation, but it's actually also a legal obligation.
These are not without precedent. We had the ozone layer treaty. We've had the law of the sea, which you might want to mention.
Yes, and the ozone is actually quite a good example because it's one of the few examples of where internationally we have successfully tackled an environmental problem. Unfortunately, many environmental problems that we have tackled, we've not been particularly successful at the global level. But ozone is actually one of those rare examples of where the problem was identified and actually identified at the fairly early stages. States came together. They put in place appropriate institutions. They addressed issues such as equity, supporting developing states, and they adopted progressive obligations, which essentially phased out ozone-depleting substances. And that worked really well. Unfortunately, climate change is a much more complex issue than the ozone, which is why it's been much more challenging to address.
Who came together on the ozone layer?
Well, all states, but one difference is the United States was leading that process. So we actually had a situation where, interestingly, economically, it was in the interests of the United States because they were actually producing alternatives to ozone-depleting substances. So actually, from an economic perspective as well as an environmental perspective, they were in favour of the convention. But actually, in the end, all states came together. And the ozone treaty, the Montreal Protocol, is actually the only treaty to which every state is a party.
What does it mean that you think the United Nations seems weaker than it was in some ways? If you talk about their ability to prevent war, for instance, in where Iraq, Ukraine, and the veto. Would strengthening the UN help with the climate change battle?
Well, I don't think it would hurt if we had a stronger United Nations. As you say, it has been weakened significantly, really, over the more recent decades. I guess one might question whether it's ever been able to effectively prevent war. As you say, one of the challenges is that the United Nations Security Council, which was intended to be the institution to take action in cases of conflict, generally has been unable to do so owing to the veto. So there are genuine problems with the United Nations in terms of its structure and its operation. But of course, it's also been deliberately undermined by states, particularly the United States, over the last few years. And it's not simply a case of the Trump government, although the Trump government is obviously very anti-United Nations. So they are withholding funding, which obviously is making things very difficult. So there are processes which are undergoing for reform to try to improve processes, but obviously it is very difficult. But I think the challenges with the United Nations also kind of reflects a broader challenge to international law. So, of course, we're really in a period where international law is under huge challenge. And I think one of the differences today, because, of course, one can say that international law has always been breached by the powerful states. But I think one of the differences today is that some states are actually simply ignoring international law. So rather than breaching it and attempting to justify their action under international law, they're simply regarding international law as irrelevant. And that, to me, is the greatest threat to the international legal system. And of course, the United Nations is sort of the founding part of the modern international legal system. So if you're disregarding international law, then you're also undermining the UN system.
Yeah, I once said in tongue-in-cheek that it was better to have international law that even though it was breached by most of the big, powerful nations, It was better to have that and even hypocrisy than to have no international law or having a situation where there was no shame in invading another country or assassinating a world leader, or there's no shame in lying. That this puts us in a very difficult situation.
Well, it does, and I would agree with you. I mean, obviously, one doesn't like hypocrisy, but I think I would agree that hypocrisy is in some ways preferable to disregard. I mean, New Zealand particularly relies on international law, rules, and institutions. New Zealand is a small state, small economy, negligible military. It cannot prevent states from breaching international law, from invading, from taking action, using its resources. It can only do so essentially relying on those rules and institutions and actually participating within international processes to influence those rules. So for small and indeed medium-sized states, those are all heavily reliant on international laws and institutions in order to further their international interests and to protect their domestic interests. So I think there's a very significant imperative to sort of protect the international legal system, but acknowledging international law has not benefited all states equally, and that it does need reform.
I'm not supporting hypocrisy. I'm sad in some ways that New Zealand has, I think, been hypocritical, especially recently about climate change and our commitments to international law. We want international law when it comes to trade, but we're not so keen on international law when it means that it'll affect our methane output or our economy.
That's right, yes, and I would agree with that. I think New Zealand could do more to, directly support the system. I mean, it talks quite a lot about supporting international law, but it is inconsistent in terms of, states that it challenges, where those states have breached international law. And where you have that inconsistency, whilst I understand it from a political perspective, the risk is that inconsistency starts to undermine that support for international law.
What does it mean when countries that have seriously increased their carbon-free sources of energy, such as electric cars, solar panels, and wind farms, are still burning increasing amounts of carbon?
Well, that's clearly not ideal, and I'm sort of assuming here you might be alluding to China, because that's obviously a really good example of a state which has taken very significant action.
But also Northern Europe to some extent.
Well, that's right. And I would say actually perhaps the differences between China and Northern Europe, or there is a difference between the two, because of course China is attempting to develop. So China is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide at the moment, but it is also seriously investing in those renewable energies. So we have that tension between states choosing to sort of, or wanting to develop, reasonably wanting to develop, but how they can do so in a way which is sustainable. I mean, Europe's a sort of an interesting example because, of course, they're obviously those states are developed, but as you say, they are continuing to burn carbon, and of course, we've seen that where you only need a small number of international shocks for carbon suddenly to come back to the fore. So when, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, and there were very significant concerns about supplies of oil to Europe, there was interest in sort of reopening coal mines and so forth. So, the commitment to renewables, the commitment to that level of sustainability can be quite fragile. So in terms of what it means, you can sort of see that states are making effort, but arguably not making effort sufficiently fast enough.
The invasion of Ukraine is a tragedy not only for Ukrainians but for the world, because it seems to me that that's hurt the climate change movement in Europe considerably. They're building defense weapons, and they feel they have to. And
well, that's absolutely right. So I think
there's hardly a bigger user of carbon than the military.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. And of course, that actually is not really captured in the various reports that states make in relation to their own contributions and their own efforts. So military is largely outside of that. But you're absolutely right, it makes a significant contribution. And I guess as states increase their military defensive, as all states seem to be going down that track, then that is going to increase. So we've got a real tension. And I would say also not just the military. So there's a real disconnect in terms of, developing new technologies and how they relate to climate change. So generative AI is quite a good example. That is potentially problematic for a whole range of reasons, but states and companies are pretty excited about it. And yet it's very significant from a climate point of view in relation to the data centers. So we're essentially investing very significantly in these new technologies, which at the moment are likely to contribute significantly to carbon emissions or potentially can do so in the future, even though we know, even though we're trying to get emissions otherwise down. So there's that disconnect between the climate and kind of other activities.
I've heard theories that these podcast depots will actually use more energy and carbon than the automobile industry in a short period of time.
Yes, I can't speak to that specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised because I understand that these data centers require very significant amounts of energy. So obviously it depends where that energy is coming from, whether it's renewable and whether these companies invest in offsets. But nevertheless, this is essentially a new source of emissions, and people need to make up their minds as to whether actually that's an appropriate use of our valuable resources.
It's not only using carbon, it is also using energy that could be used for other things like public transport or...
That's right. I mean, states have to decide, what they're going to invest in, how they're going to invest. And I think, again, one of the challenges with many states, including New Zealand, is that there is insufficient investment in things like public transport and infrastructure, which kind of will support people from moving away from fossil fuels.
When it comes to the use of fossil fuels for podcasts and so on, it isn't the states that's deciding, it's these major corporations that are deciding. States are letting corporations decide.
Yes, that's right. But states still have to give permission for data centers to be sited. There are processes in most states, including New Zealand, as to whether you can have a data center and what the conditions are, for example. So states can have some involvement there.
But they have to take some responsibility to do that.
They do. They absolutely do.
And that's the problem, isn't it?
It is a problem. But again, international law, I mean, one of the, I think, positive developments over the last couple of years has actually been in the development of the principles which apply to international law outside of the climate change regime. And coming back to the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, they made that really clear. So I guess we need to get to the stage where states really start to understand that there are clear obligations that they owe, not just their own people, but the international community at large. And we think about how those are enforced. And one way of doing that, which is happening in New Zealand and is happening in a lot of other countries, are that citizens and groups are actually challenging government decisions for their own domestic courts for taking insufficient actions or for taking actions which are contrary to climate change policy.
Do you think New Zealanders should have the right and obligation to take the government to court when they're not following international law?
Well, yes, and they do. So it depends on the nature of the international law, but there are processes for that. And in fact, there is a case ongoing at the moment, which is challenging New Zealand as taking insufficient action or inappropriate action. So the New Zealand government is in fact responding to a challenge before its courts. But of course, one of the problems we've had this year in a separate case, and this is actually a case against a private corporation, the government obviously is adopting legislation which would prevent people from taking such action within the courts. And that's actually caused quite a lot of concern in the legal community, just in terms of the broader precedent that sets about the government stepping in and preventing the courts from essentially looking to see whether the law should appropriately apply to climate change in particular contexts. In this case, it's tort law, whether tort law should apply to corporations such as Fonterra.
This, in a way, ironic, because we have a government that's very keen on individual freedom, yet we're saying individuals can't go to court on environmental laws so they can't take a tort against corporations.
Well, it's certainly an example of really significant government intervention, which arguably is sort of doesn't sit particularly happily with individual freedom. It's obviously supporting the freedom of companies as opposed to the freedom of individuals. But yes, I mean, this is quite an interesting kind of level of state intervention.
So when we talk about freedom, are we talking about real freedom for the community, or are we talking about freedom to increase wealth, the freedom to do as you will with your wealth?
Well, I would suggest that the decision that the government made in relation to that legislation would have been more about freedom of wealth as opposed to freedom of individuals. But I think, Marvin, you raised a really interesting broader point about freedom, because, of course, climate change is absolutely an issue where we're actually going to have to think quite carefully about how we respond and how that impacts on people's freedoms and who we're talking about in terms of those freedoms. Because, of course, calls for greater government intervention may restrict freedoms. There's quite a lot of discussion in terms of adaptation as to whether people should be required to move locations. What are the obligations of government to kind of shore up unstable coastlines and so forth? So actually, climate change does, raise really important questions of kind of, well, whose freedoms are we protecting? How far do we protect those freedoms? And how do we kind of manage the freedoms of individuals today with the freedoms of sort of future generations tomorrow?
Jonathan Boston's actually written a book about this. In a way, he doesn't call it that, but about the effect of climate change on property values, on insurance, and saying that people will need to be moved and will have to move, but at the same time, that we have to be responsible for people that have to move so that they still have homes to live in, so they aren't destroyed as a family. So.
Absolutely right. And the question is, well, who bears that risk? Is it the individual? Is it insurance? Is the government? But I think you're right. As we go further in the future, unfortunately, some locations, won't be appropriate to live in, and that will affect people. People will have to move.
Yet, the insurance companies are saying they won't cover it after a while. We've got clear indications of that. So if the insurance companies won't cover it, and the government says they're not responsible, which is this government saying actually now, where does that leave people? And how do you get people to take clear efforts for the resilience of the places where they live, resilience for communities, if you have both the insurance companies and the government saying, it's not our responsibility. I don't want to be called to be responsible for the common good. That's not why I got elected.
Yes. Well, you're absolutely right. And it's hugely complex. And of course, it's complex because it potentially involves, very significant resources. So if you're going to essentially move people or pay people out, if the government's going to pay for that, essentially it's the taxpayer that's going to pay for that. So the question is, where should that burden fall? Does it fall on the individual? Does it fall on the government? Does it fall on corporations? And these are definitely questions which all countries are sort of facing and addressing in slightly different ways.
Well, some countries are addressing it. Some are avoiding addressing it.
Well, that's right. Yes.
I was interested, actually, in the new Pope's concern with not only the artificial intelligence, but also the idea of the environment and the economy. The economy somehow shouldn't be about exploiting people. It should be about looking after the common good, looking after people. Is he wrong to say that?
I don't think he's wrong to say that. I think it requires, that essentially requires quite a significant conceptual shift. But I would imagine a lot of people, whether they are Catholic or not, do agree with that approach. But of course, that requires, a very significant shift, which again kind of goes back to the sort of the Anthropocene concept, that we need to sort of move away from the idea of perpetual economic growth. We need to sort of reorganize around, different concepts and principles. But that's pretty hard for
if we don't deny,
and indeed individuals to do so.
If we don't deny climate change, then the governments have an ironclad responsibility to look after the common good. If you say climate change really isn't happening, that well then you don't have to do anything. Or if you say we'll have a technical fix, so we can just wait until we come up with a technical fix. But if you take climate change seriously, you have to take governance seriously.
I couldn't agree more. I suppose one of the challenges, I absolutely agree it's about governments, but I suppose it's also about society, because particularly, obviously, in democratic states, governments can't really go against, if they make a lot of very unpopular decisions, they're simply going to get voted out. So you also need to sort of, change the hearts and minds, as it were, of your public as well, so that people agree that these measures need to be taken.
I would say action and talking is how you change people's hearts and minds. I wasn't old enough to see it, but I know that for a long time America was influenced by what the Roosevelt administration did in the New Deal. In fact, that's one of the big goals of the Conservative Party, is just undo the values of the New Deal and of the welfare state in places like England. But government's part of the responsibility of government is to lead. I mean, you can't expect the corporations to lead, or you can't expect them to lead in a way where they actually make less money.
I absolutely agree. Yes, governments have got to lead, and I think your examples, of the welfare state, of the New Deal, kind of demonstrate that governments can make very significant changes, significant investments, if they choose to. Now, of course, interestingly, both those, came after quite significant kind of international crises, whether that was the Depression,
the Great Depression,
World War II.
yes.
So you had sort of major kind of crises which sort of led to a point at which significant change had to be made. And I would suggest that climate change, kind of falls within that category. We will get to the point where it'll be a sufficient crisis that change will have to be made. But obviously, preferably, we want to try to make change before we get to that point.
The problem is that when you get to that point, you're probably past some tipping points.
There is the risk of that. Yes.
One of the things I've always been cautious about, but I had to change my mind, I think, in the last 10 years, especially the last 5 years, when I realized that the powers that be weren't going to do much about climate change. And that's geoengineering. Can you talk about geoengineering? Both its problems and if it's a necessity.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess geoengineering is this idea of this techno fix. You mentioned it earlier, this idea that if we wait long enough, we will invent our way out of the crisis. So, geoengineering really relates to technologies or processes which directly interfere with Earth systems. And it kind of falls into two categories. So you have solar radiation management, SRM, whereby you are essentially developing technologies which reflect sunlight back from the Earth, and that reduces temperature. So whether that's mirrors in space or putting reflective material on the oceans, or possibly sort of aerosols in the atmosphere. And then the second option is your carbon dioxide removal, where you are essentially taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and you are either putting it into the oceans or you're potentially putting it into the ground. There's been quite a lot of discussion about geoengineering for at least the last kind of 20 years. It was kind of quite fringe many years ago. And then there was quite a lot of discussion probably about a decade ago. And actually, it's kind of come back in terms of international discussion. I'm quite a skeptic. I'm quite interested in it. I've actually written quite a lot on it from a legal perspective. But I am a skeptic. Certainly from what I've read, it's entirely untested. So what we have got is, quite small field trials or simply kind of theoretical experiments. So, there's not a lot of evidence which supports the idea that this will work. I think there are quite significant moral hazard issues associated with it. There's no doubt there's interest in it because states and indeed companies feel, well, they don't then need to change their other practices. You can still release carbon dioxide, you can still use fossil fuels because we have a way of mitigating the effects. And I think it doesn't address the causes of climate change. And of course, it potentially really significantly limits future options. So if you're not addressing the causes and you put in place a techno fix, you're essentially going to have to continue that techno fix, which means future generations kind of have those limited options. On the other hand, there are those which kind of argue, well, we're at the stage where, even if we kind of stopped all emissions tomorrow, there are still going to be significant implications of climate change, whether that's sea level rise or sort of heat in the atmosphere. And we need to take more dramatic action. There's been discussion more recently about this idea of overshoot, whereby we kind of accepted that we are going to get to 1.5, if not beyond. There's nothing we can do about that. And we then need to take measures to get us back to 1.5 as a temperature increase, and using these technologies in order to kind of get us back to address the overshoot. So there's quite a lot of concerns, I would say. Another concern, which I think speaks to your points that you've been making about corporations, is that there's quite a lot of interest by corporations in this and for the purpose of making money. So there are corporations which are already engaging in practices such as ocean fertilization and trying to sell carbon credits, even though they are not particularly worth anything, but nevertheless, that's clearly their motivation. So one of the risks in terms of kind of who should be doing this, should it be government or corporations, is that there is a risk that corporations could possibly go ahead and kind of deploy some of these technologies without sufficient control. So I'm quite a geoengineering skeptic, but I do understand the argument that, we're not really taking action or meaningful action in kind of other areas. So it could possibly come to that.
One of the problems I see with geoengineering, though, as I say, I'm more torn than I was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I knew exactly what I thought about it. Is that once you start, you can't stop. And if it's highly technical, for instance, if you're using satellites in space, where does that leave you? I mean, if you stop, all of a sudden, climate change will go zoom. I mean, it'll really come back in a big way, as I understand it. And I don't think I'm necessarily wrong about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a problem. If you're not addressing the causes of climate change, you're simply addressing the symptoms. then yes, arguably you have to continue with those technologies unless you find, alternative technologies. If you can, and that kind of then limits the options of your future generation. So, yeah, I think really we need to make concerted efforts about moving away from fossil fuels as being sort of the core issue, rather than investing in these technologies. And that's the other kind of issue. All these technologies need very significant levels of investment. So the question is, well, is that where we should be putting our resources, or should we actually be putting our resources into renewables, into kind of other ways of actually addressing the causes?
The other thing that worries me is that we talk a lot about, and climate change is the most immediate problem we're facing, but it's only one of them, is the way I understand it. Is climate change the only serious threat to our environment that we have? And will cutting emissions mean that we can carry on with our current economic growth system as long as we use non-carbon energy?
No, unfortunately not. We often talk about the triple planetary threat. And that triple threat is climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste. So we're undergoing what many commentators describe as the sixth extinction. So essentially the sixth major geological extinction event, because species are going extinct at a much more rapid rate than they have over the past many thousand years, as a consequence of kind of overhunting, overfishing, habitat loss, invasive species, climate change, etc. So that is a major threat. And many actually argue that that is the equivalent of climate change as a threat. And then, of course, in relation to pollution, nitrogen, chemicals, plastic pollution, that's all affecting our soils, our fresh water, our oceans. So actually, climate change is a major challenge, but it's actually one of a number of challenges. And of course, all of the challenges are kind of connected. As climate warms, that has implications for habitat, for species, also has implications in terms of sort of our chemical cycles. Some scholars look at a framework called planetary boundaries, which is quite useful. It's come out of Sweden and various academics there, the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and they've actually identified 9 planetary boundaries. And what they do within that is that they've identified sort of what they describe as safe operating space. And then you have a threshold at which point you're operating in an unsafe space, so a little bit like a tipping point. So there are 9 planetary boundaries, and in their view, we've actually crossed 6 of those. So that includes things like climate change, biosphere integrity, land use change, fresh water. So we're actually in an unsafe operating space for 6 of those 9s. The 3 that actually we haven't crossed is ozone, where, as I mentioned earlier, we've actually managed that quite sensibly, air pollution, and I'm just trying to think what the third one was, and I'll have to come back to the third one, but it's also connected to the air. Point being, though, is that actually, there are, unfortunately, we are having an impact on our global environment across territories, oceans, atmosphere, which again speaks to this kind of the Anthropocene idea, given its broad nature.
Of course, what kind of society do we need if we're going to drastically deal with these boundaries? What kind of economic and social society should we be looking at?
Well, that's a challenging question to ask a lawyer, because we're more focusing on sort of the institutions and the processes. But ultimately, I think your point you made, earlier on in the discussion, that it really comes down to sort of our economic processes. And I don't think we can continue with this idea of economic growth. So we need to kind of accept, a different economic model. But also, a model which addresses sort of equity. So that, involves not just getting more resources, but also transferring resources, to states that need it. And that is a very different, that's a very different way of thinking about a future society. And if we think about kind of how society has evolved and kind of quite significant changes, particularly from an international law point of view with the establishment of the rules-based order from 1945 onwards, I would suggest that the change we're looking at now, is much more significant, much more transformational than the change was in 1945 from what went before. So it's a pretty significant challenge. But I think we are going to have to sort of really address, economic growth, address fossil fuels, and there are some sort of signs. So, for example, earlier this year, there was a conference held on the sort of just transition away from fossil fuels. And this kind of led from...
Was that in Colombia?
Yeah, it was. And it was it led on from a declaration which was adopted actually at the climate change conference in Belém last year. Some states were quite disappointed there was no reference to fossil fuels in the general declaration. So they adopted a declaration, the Belém Declaration on Transition Away from Fossil Fuels, really to start a conversation on it. And it's very early stages, and there was a conference this year. There are 50 odd states, which attended. New Zealand did not, I would like to note. But so I think there are potentially sort of signs at which, we're at least beginning to think about a new world order. But it's pretty challenging. In terms of what the world might look like, I wonder whether Marvin and I can recommend. Actually, it's a novel I read earlier this year, which is one of the most powerful things I've read on climate change recently. It's Ian McEwan's latest novel, What We Can Know. I'm quite a Ian McEwan fan, and it's a great story. But actually, it's really interesting on climate change. So it's set in 2014 and 2190, so kind of over 100 years in the future. And he kind of envisaged essentially a very low growth sort of economy, and things have significantly changed. And what I found really interesting was how the protagonists in 2190 kind of talked about people in 2014 and the morals of the actions taken in 2014. And he describes the period 2014 to about 2030 as the great derangement. This idea that people know that their actions are having negative impacts on climate, but they're still acting anyway. And I kind of wonder whether, however many years in the future, we will, or future generations will kind of look back on my generation, your generation, the way we look back on generations that were slave owners in the 19th century,
or we look back
kind of how that morality.
Or how we look back on what happened in World War II.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think it's, I think there's some kind of really interesting, we're going to have to really rethink our economy and our processes.
I suspect that we actually have to think about equality more seriously, because I think both internationally but also domestically, I don't think people will accept the great changes that are needed unless they feel like the people that are making decisions have a sense of the common good. And if they see equality increasing at the same time they're asked to make the sacrifices, which happened in Great Britain, by the way, during World War II. The working class ate better under rationing than they had before. But you have to, it seems to me you need that combination.
I would agree, and I think in some ways this represents an opportunity, because although we talk about the rules-based order in very positive terms, particularly in New Zealand and sort of like-minded states, there are many states which would regard, the current rules-based order as being fundamentally inequitable and essentially kind of preserving those original power bases. So if we have an opportunity to kind of transform both internationally and domestically our kind of orders, then equality, I agree, has got to be at the heart of it.
So what are your hopes?
What are my hopes? That's a big question. Well, I think I am hopeful at times. There are times where I'm less hopeful, but I am hopeful. I do think the decision of the International Court of Justice is a really hopeful decision. I see around the world groups and individuals challenging governments on their inaction, and I find that really hopeful. There are lots of sort of groups, lots of ideas which are kind of beginning to come through. So I do have a level of hope, but at the same time, we are living in a really challenging international legal order. And unfortunately, the current geopolitical challenges, which are not necessarily directly connected to climate change, are definitely going to make it more difficult for states to take action on climate change, certainly in the next couple of years. But I do see that there are elements for hope.
Well, thanks a lot for coming on the show and for expressing both the problems and the hopes, Karen Scott.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Marvin.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.